I had gone into town for salt. That's all it was supposed to be. Just salt and a few sacks of flour to carry me through the coming winter. I didn't speak to anyone more than I had to. Didn't linger in the streets. Didn't look too long at anyone's eyes. 32 years of keeping to myself made that kind of detachment easy. I lived on the edge of the northern timberline, where trees whispered things you couldn't repeat, and the wind carried voices only a madman would answer. It was the way I liked it. It was the way I survived. The merchant was new. I'd never seen him before, but that wasn't unusual. The road in and out of that half-dead town was long, and merchants came and went like ghosts passing through. This one didn't ask questions. He had the goods, and he seemed almost too eager to unload a particular crate. Said it had extra-stossed it in with my order for half the price. I didn't question it. Just loaded the cart and rode home through the snow-dusted pines, the sky pressing down gray and low, the air sharp with the promise of frost. I didn't open the crate until I got back to the cabin. There was no rush. Supplies were supplies. I lit the fire, boiled water, went about my routine. Everything moved in that slow, deliberate rhythm I'd carved for myself after decades of solitude. Nothing ever interrupted it until I heard the faintest rustle from inside the box. At first, I thought it was an animal. A raccoon, maybe? Or something smaller that had crawled in looking for warmth. But then came the sound that stopped me cold. A breath. Thin, shuddering, wet with fear. I pried the lid loose, and what I saw inside knocked the wind from my chest. A baby. Tiny, flushed with cold, wrapped in a torn blanket, dark eyes wide open and locked on mine, not crying, not moving, just staring like it understood something I hadn't yet begun to grasp. I didn't move for what felt like minutes. The fire crackled behind me, throwing long shadows across the floor, and that child's eyes never blinked. I don't know how long I stood there, holding the lid like a shield between us. My fingers were shaking, not from cold, but something older. Something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Fear. Not of the child, no. Fear of what this meant. Fear of what this would require of me. I had buried my wife 29 years ago, just past the final frost. We'd never had children. Couldn't, we were told. After she passed, the silence became my companion. A stern one, but dependable. The kind that didn't ask anything of you. This baby. He asked everything just by existing. I lifted him gently, God. He was lightened, cradled him in arms that hadn't held anything living in decades. His fingers curled weakly around my thumb. That small grip was a chain stronger than any steel. I should have ridden back into town right then. Asked questions. Demanded answers. But something in me knew the answers wouldn't help. Something about the merchant's eyes, the way he'd hurried me along, the bruises I hadn't wanted to see under the baby's blanket. This wasn't a lost child. This was a discarded one, thrown into the wilderness like unwanted freight. And now he was mine to deal with. I wrapped him tighter and placed him near the fire, fed him drops of warm water until his breathing evened out. The night came fast, too fast. And so I stayed up, listening to every creak of the wood, every moan of the wind. That was when I heard the horses. Not one, not two, multiple, hooves cutting through the hard soil, stopping just beyond the tree line. Men dismounting, voices low, urgent. I froze. My rifle was near the door, always loaded. 30 years out here had taught me not to take chances. I moved to the window and looked through the crack in the shutter. 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, coats dirty with travel, eyes sharp and searching. They hadn't seen me yet, but they were coming toward the cabin, purposeful, like they knew exactly what they were after. The baby stirred behind me, letting out the softest sound. I moved fast, slipping the crate lid back over and sliding it behind the sacks of flour. Just as the knock came at the door, I didn't answer, just stood there, heart pounding, fingers flexing around the rifle grip. 30 years of peace gone in a single breath. They knocked again, this time harder. Then came the voice. Calm, measured, but wrong in a way I couldn't place. Said they were looking for a merchant. Said he sold them something that belonged to them. A crate. My stomach turned. I kept my voice steady. Told them I'd seen the merchant. Bought grain. Nothing more. But they didn't believe me. Not really. The woman stepped closer to the door. Her voice cracked when she spoke, like someone holding back desperation with a threadbare mask of calm. She asked if he'd sold me anything else. A crate, maybe with something inside. The baby made another soft cry, and I coughed, loud and harsh, masking the sound. They offered money. $50, enough to stock my shelves for months, enough to buy a new roof. But the number didn't tempt me. It was the urgency in their voices that told the truth. They needed that child back. And not because they cared about him. I lied again. Said I had nothing more than salt and flour. Then the baby cried. A sharp, unmistakable sound. All three of them tensed. One man reached for his gun. I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, blocking the door. Told them they were on private land, that I didn't take kindly to strangers sniffing around. Their eyes shifted, calculating. They weren't afraid. But they hadn't expected resistance either. The woman said the baby's name was Thomas, said he'd been taken from her, that she was his mother. But she didn't cry when she said it, didn't plead. She watched my face like a poker player waiting for a tell. Thomas. The name didn't fit the face of the boy who'd clung to my thumb like it was the last piece of the world he trusted. They didn't press further. Not yet. Just stood there watching, waiting. And I knew. In my bones, I knew. These people didn't come to reclaim something lost. They came to take something valuable. And the baby in my cabin was worth more than I dared imagine. I didn't sleep that night. Not a second. Every flicker of flame, every gust of wind against the cabin wall I treated like a warning. The kind of warning a man can't afford to ignore. I sat in the corner, rifle across my lap, the crate beside me. I could hear the child breathing inside, slow and even. He hadn't made a sound since the strangers rode off just before midnight, their silhouettes swallowed by the forest. They hadn't gotten what they came for. That much was clear. But they hadn't given up either. You don't ride that far, with desperation in your bones and weapons on your belt, just to walk away empty-handed. They'd be back. And next time, they might not bother knocking. The boy Thomas, if that really was his name, had fallen asleep, curled into a nest of blankets I'd lined inside a wooden crate. I kept the fire burning low and steady to keep the cabin warm, but not so bright it might give our position away to someone watching from the trees. I didn't know if they were still out there, waiting, circling, but I wasn't going to take that chance. My cabin had always been a fortress, not by design, but by habit. When you live alone for 3 decades, you start reinforcing things, even if you don't consciously mean to. Bolts on every window, latches on doors. A hidden crawl space under the floorboards, packed with emergency rations and old ammunition. I never planned for a siege, but now it looked like I might be in one. And I wasn't alone anymore. That thought struck harder than the rest. For years, solitude had been my religion, the only truth I held to. I didn't speak unless I had to. I didn't write letters. I didn't invite anyone in, and no one ever came. And yet there I was, guarding a child like he was mine. Not because I had to, because something in me demanded I do it. As Dawn stretched pale fingers across the floorboards, the baby stirred. He didn't cry, not right away. Just made soft, questioning sounds like he was trying to understand where he was and why everything felt unfamiliar. I reached into the crate and lifted him out. He was warmer now, his cheeks a healthy pink. I fed him milk I'd warmed by the hearth, slowly tipping the old bottle I'd found in the back of a cabinet God knows how many years ago. Never thought I'd use it. Never thought I'd need to. He watched me the whole time, those dark eyes unblinking. There was something unsettling about how quiet he was. No fear, no fuss. Just this watchful, intense stare like he was trying to read something in my face. Maybe he could. I started talking, not because I expected him to understand, but because silence suddenly felt wrong. Told him about the pines beyond the ridge and how the snow would start soon. Told him about the hawks that circled overhead and the coyote pups that would howl at dusk. Told him about the way the mountains looked in the winter, like gods sleeping under a white sheet. He didn't react, but I kept talking. I couldn't stop. By the time the sun was fully up, I knew I'd already made my choice. I wasn't giving him up. Not to them. Not to anyone. But choices come with consequences. That's what people never think about. They act like once you choose, that's the end of it. But choosing is just the beginning. Everything after that's the cost. I spent the morning preparing the cabin for whatever came next. Barricaded the windows with extra planks, moved furniture to form choke points, set traps around the property not enough to kill, just to warn. I didn't want bloodshed if I could avoid it, but I wasn't going to let these people walk in and take the boy either. Every now and then, I'd glance at him. He'd fallen asleep again, tucked in the crook of my old coat like he belonged there. And I realized something I hadn't dared admit. I'd already bonded with him. Not just out of pity. Not just out of duty. There was something else. A pull. A tether. I didn't know what it meant or what it would lead to. I just knew I couldn't let anything happen to him. Not on my watch. I went out that afternoon, just to the edge of the woods. My rifle slung across my shoulder, eyes scanning every shadow. I found fresh tracks. Horse tracks. They circled wide, looping around the perimeter of my land like vultures waiting for something to die. They hadn't left. They were watching, planning, waiting for the right moment. I kicked snow over the prints, marked the trees with faint carvings to track their positions. It was something my father taught me back when I was a boy before everything fell apart. Use the woods. Let them work for you. When I returned to the cabin, the baby was awake again. I half expected him to be crying from hunger or fear, but Nohe was calm, alert. I didn't know much about children, but I knew this wasn't normal. He was watching me the way a man watches another man across a poker table, like he knew something. That night, the wind picked up, howling through the chimney like a warning cry. I didn't sleep. Again. Just sat by the fire, holding the rifle, baby sleeping in the crate beside me. The weight of what was coming pressed down like a stone on my chest. And that's when I saw the first fire. A flicker of orange through the trees. A campfire. Then another. 2 groups, maybe more. No attempt to hide them now. They wanted me to see. Wanted me to know I was surrounded. I felt a sick heat rise in my gut. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was something organized. These people weren't here just for revenge, or greed, or even that child. They were here for something bigger, something darker. And the baby he was the center of it. I didn't know why. Not yet, but I would. Because I had no intention of letting him go. Not while I was breathing. I didn't light a fire the next night. Not because it wasn't cold it was, but because warmth could betray you. Firelight dancing on cabin walls, shadows flickering through shutter cracks. It was a beacon to anyone watching in the dark. So I sat still in the cold, a thick wool blanket around my shoulders, and the baby wrapped tight in a bundle on my lap. He'd fallen asleep again, not peacefully. He whimpered in his sleep like someone haunted by memories too large for his tiny frame. That made 2 of us. His presence had cracked open something in me I thought was long sealed shut. Old memories started creeping back. Memories I'd spent decades shoving into the dark corners of my mind. I remembered the smell of rosemary in my wife's hair. I remembered the way she smiled at the horizon, like she could read the future in the shape of the clouds. I remembered the baby we almost had, the one who didn't make it. He was going to be named Elias, after my father. He never took a breath. After that, something inside me broke. My wife tried to reach me, trying to hold us together, but I was already drifting towards silence. I built this cabin with my own hands, way out here, far from anything that could remind me of what I'd lost. I convinced myself it was freedom, but now I understood it was exile. And yet, fate had a cruel sense of humor. Or maybe it was mercy in disguise. Either way, it had brought me this baby. Not Elias, not a second chance exactly, but something close enough to set fire to every wall I'd built. Still, love wouldn't be enough. Not against what was coming. By the 3rd day, I'd counted at least 9 separate tracks in the woods. Fresh, wide spacing, some on horseback, some on foot. They were circling tighter now, I could feel it. The wind carried their scent, sometimes pipe smoke, unwashed leather, gun oil. Whoever they were biding their time. That night, I moved the baby into the crawl space beneath the cabin, lined it with thick wool, stocked it with jars of milk, and built a vent system using copper tubing so he could breathe freely even if the cabin was burning. I told myself it was precaution, but deep down, I knew I was preparing for a worst-case scenario. Still, there was one question I couldn't let go. Why this child? If it was ransom, they would have demanded something by now. If it was revenge, they wouldn't be so quiet. This wasn't random. Someone wanted this child, needed him, badly enough to kill for him, badly enough to risk open conflict. And that meant he wasn't just some orphan in a crate. He was a target, maybe even a symbol. But of what? I still didn't know. What I did know was that he was safer with me than with them. Late that afternoon, just before dusk, I found something on my doorstep. A folded piece of paper pinned under a rock. No footprints in the snow, which told me someone had backtracked carefully. No smell, no broken branches, just the note. I unfolded it with gloved hands. It read, "You can't keep him. He belongs to something bigger. Walk away while you still can." No name, no threat. Just a cold fact dressed like advice. I burned the note in the stove and watched the paper curl into ash. That night, the baby had his first real laugh. Just a small sound, high-pitched and fleeting, but it hit me like a punch to the ribs. I found myself laughing too, for the first time in maybe 20 years. And then I cried. He didn't sleep again. The next morning, I found one of my traps snapped clean through the ankle of a large boot print, but empty. Whoever it was had been fast. Or lucky. I checked the perimeter. They were closer than ever. It was time for answers. So I packed a small bag, tucked the baby in a sling across my chest under my coat, and rode down to town. First time in over a year. The town was still quiet, the way these frontier places always are. A couple of wagons creaked down the main road. A dog barked at nothing. Smoke from the blacksmith's forge curled into the gray sky like a signal. I tied my horse outside the general store and walked in. The storekeeper, Martha, looked up with eyes that blinked in disbelief. "Silas Whitmore," she said. "I'll be damned. You still alive?" "More or less," I muttered. Her gaze dropped to the bundle under my coat. "You bring something with you?" I nodded. "Need milk." "More than usual." She didn't ask questions. That's one thing I always liked about Martha. She didn't push. While she filled the bottles, I leaned over the counter. "You hear anything strange in the past few days? Riders in black coats? Folks asking questions?" Her hands froze. "You mean the Denver men? What about them?" "They came through 2 days ago. Had money, shiny guns, and dead eyes. Asking if anyone's seen a baby. Real insistent. Had a drawing even. Said it was their nephew. But I've seen the kind of nephews they claim before. Ain't no family looking for love riding like that." "Did they say what they wanted with him?" Martha looked around and lowered her voice. "Said the boy's bloodline mattered. Something about a name Delancey, I think. Said if they didn't find him soon, others would come. Worse ones." I felt my mouth go dry. Delancey? That name meant nothing to me. But it sounded like the kind of name people killed to protect or exploit. I paid for the milk, tipped my hat to Martha, and rode back hard. By the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the pines. Smoke curled in the distance from my chimney, but I hadn't lit a fire. I dropped the reins and ran, heart pounding, rifles swinging against my shoulder. The front door was ajar. Inside, the cabin was empty. Too empty. The crawl space was open, wool blankets thrown aside, and the baby he was gone. On the table, written in soot across the old wood surface, were 3 chilling words. "You waited too long." I ran into the woods like a man possessed. No coat, no gloves, no plan, just my rifle, my boots, and the fire inside me growing hotter with every step. I didn't feel the cold. I didn't feel the branches slapping my face or the rocks slicing into my palms when I stumbled. I didn't feel the ache in my chest, even as it burned like a forge bellows. All I could feel was the absence of his weight on my chest, the silence where his breath used to be, the stillness of the world without that tiny, fragile heartbeat anchoring me to this cruel earth. I had buried a wife once. I had buried a child I never got to hold. I would not bury this one. The snow held track-steep impressions from boots and horses, fresh enough that flakes hadn't yet softened their edges. Whoever took him had moved fast but heavy. They didn't care about stealth anymore. They had what they came for. They thought that was the end of it. But it was only the beginning. I followed the trail with the focus of a bloodhound. My eyes adjusted to every nuance in the terrain: the disturbed moss, the snapped branches, the faint scuff marks on stones that told me where hooves had slipped. I could tell the lead rider was nervous. His horse was pushing too hard. That left signs. Mistakes. By sundown, I had covered nearly 8 miles of hard ground. My legs screamed. My lungs burned. It didn't stop. Not when the first stars emerged. Not when the forest turned to shadow and silence. The only sound that mattered was the phantom echo of a baby's cry, buried somewhere deep in my memory. Around midnight, I found their first resting point, a small clearing near the river. Cold ashes in a ring of stones, bits of jerky left behind, boot prints. Spaced wide, 2 standing guard, 1 pacing back and forth. No sign of the baby. But something else caught my eye. A cloth scrap, pale blue, frayed on one side, tucked near a log where it must have fallen from a blanket. I held it to my face and breathed in. Milk, wood smoke, a hint of lavender oil. I closed my eyes and let that scent pull me back together. He was alive, still close. I moved like a ghost through the forest. By the second day, the temperature had dropped. Wind came in from the north, sharp as a knife. My breath fogged out in front of me, curling like smoke. I hadn't eaten since leaving the cabin. Hadn't drunk more than what snow I could scoop from low branches. But the fire inside me burned hot enough to keep me moving. Somewhere in the hills, I came across the remains of a wagon. Burned to the frame, wheels blackened, canvas cover torn to ribbons. The horses were gone. So were the riders. Blood in the snow. Not a lot, just enough to suggest a wound. Maybe a warning. Maybe a fight. I found shell casings near the edge of the trail. Modern brass. 3 of them. And something else. A pocket watch. Old, but polished. Engraved with the letter D on the back. Inside, the glass was cracked, but the photograph was intact: a man, woman, and child. The baby looked like him. Same dark eyes, same defiant jawline, same spirit. So he had a family once. Or maybe still did. But if this was their watch, then they weren't here anymore. The fire hadn't touched them. The blood hadn't come from them, which meant someone else had found the hunters. Someone not on their side. I kept walking. My boots were soaked through. My fingers felt like stone. My vision had narrowed to a tunnel focused only on prints in the snow and the flickers of movement between trees. Twice I saw wolves in the distance. They watched me, curious but cautious. They could smell something on my desperation, maybe. Or resolve. By dusk, I reached the edge of a high ridge overlooking the valley. And I saw them. A camp nestled low in the tree line. 6 men, 1 fire. Horses tied loosely around a tree. And at the center, wrapped in that same blue blanket, was the baby. Alive. Still. Cradled not with care, but like a parcel. Propped against a saddlebag. A bottle lay discarded nearby, half frozen. He wasn't crying. He looked too tired for that. Too weak. I fell to my knees behind a rise of rocks and counted each figure. Only 1 stood guard, half awake and bored. 2 more were playing cards. The rest rested against logs or bedrolls, their guns within reach. These weren't just bandits. They moved with purpose. Military precision, even. 1 man wore a patch on his coat, and insignia I didn't recognize, but one that reeked of rank. They weren't here to ransom him. They were waiting for someone. maybe a buyer, maybe their boss. Either way, time was short. I had one advantage: surprise. But surprise only gets you the first shot. After that, it's blood and fire, and whatever your willpower can carry you through. So I spent the night crawling, inch by inch, positioning myself, watching the rotation of their watchmen, learning their rhythm, memorizing the sounds of their boots, the distance between their voices. And when the sky turned gray with dawn, I moved. I came in low, from the eastern flank. I used the snow to mask my steps, the wind to cloak my scent, and every ounce of silence I'd learned from a life spent alone to keep me invisible. I got within 20 yards before the first man even looked up, but by then, my rifle was raised. I didn't speak, didn't yell, I just acted. The first shot dropped the guard. He fell backward into the fire, scattering sparks like a dying star. The others scrambled. One reached for his revolver. Too late, my second round caught him in the leg. He screamed. Then chaos broke loose. Gunfire ripped through the woods. I dove behind a fallen log as bullets tore into bark and snow exploded around me. I kept my head low and my shots steady. 1, 2, another down. But there were too many. They returned fire with military discipline. Their bullets cut through the trees like bees on a rampage. I felt one graze my rib shot, then cold. I ignored it. I crawled closer. The baby was maybe 15 feet away now. Still unmoving. Still quiet. Too quiet. I started praying, which is something I hadn't done since I watched my wife lower a tiny coffin into the frozen ground. But I prayed now. Prayed like a sinner with no last words. When I was 10 feet out, I saw the leader rise. Tall, calm, clean-shaven, eyes like steel. He didn't fire. He just walked toward the baby and drew a knife. And in that moment, I knew he wasn't here to sell the child. He was here to silence him. End a bloodline. Erase a threat. I fired again. My last round. It hit the man in the shoulder, spinning him backward. But he didn't drop the knife. So I ran, straight into the open. No cover, no plan, just raw instinct and the sound of my boots pounding snow. He turned toward me, blade raised. I tackled him to the ground. We rolled. He was stronger, faster, younger. But I had something he didn't, nothing to lose. We fought like animals. Teeth, fists, elbows. I broke his nose with my forearm. He cut my arm open from wrist to elbow. Blood sprayed across the snow like paint. But he didn't stop. Not until his blade was in my hand. And then, it was over. I didn't stay to watch him die. I crawled to the baby. He was breathing, faint but steady. His eyes fluttered open, and he smiled. Even after all that, he smiled. That was the moment I knew I'd never let him go. Even if it meant dying. Even if it meant killing. Even if it meant becoming something I swore I'd never be again. Because in that fragile, wounded, impossibly brave little face, I saw something worth saving. Something worth redeeming. Not just him, but me. We didn't return to the cabin. It was no longer safe. Its walls had been breached. Its silence shattered, its sanctuary poisoned. I had spilled blood near that hearth, taken lives that belonged to a war I hadn't agreed to fight. The forest would remember. The wind carried whispers now, and I couldn't tell which were memories and which were warnings. I wrapped the baby tighter in his blue blanket, the same one I had found abandoned days before, now crusted with frost and the faintest trace of dried milk. His body felt warmer than I expected, resilient. Against all odds, he was adapting faster than I was. While my body screamed with every movement, he simply blinked at the world with calm curiosity, as if none of it could break him. We found shelter in an old ranger station deep in the forest, long since abandoned. Its roof half collapsed, but its stone fireplace intact. I cleaned out a nest of dried leaves and raccoon droppings before settling him inside, wrapping him in my coat, and starting a fire that hissed and cracked like a beast learning to breathe again. It was there, in that forgotten ruin, that I finally opened the envelope. The one I had found wedged inside the hollow of the rifle butt days ago. The one with the name Delancey scrawled on the front in handwriting that trembled with urgency. Inside were 3 items. A photograph, a torn page from what looked like a classified dossier, and a letter written in rushed, shaky lines. The photograph showed the baby but older, maybe 3 years old, standing beside a man whose face I'd never seen but whose presence pulsed from the image like a storm cloud. He had sharp features, a tight jaw, and the kind of posture only learned in war. One of his hands rested protectively on the child's shoulder. The other held a closed file marked Official. Do not distribute. The dossier page was harder to read. Most of it was blacked out. Redactions ran across entire paragraphs, but a few phrases bled through. Subject: D. Delancey. Status: anomalous genetic profile. Clearance level: 7 or higher. Notes: offspring of redacted and redacted. Risk factor: high. Operation Chimera initiated. Orders: termination on discovery. I sat there, firelight flickering against my blood-crusted hands, and tried to make sense of the weight those words carried. Anomalous. Termination on discovery. What kind of world names a child as a threat before he can even speak? And who was I now, sitting in this crumbling shelter with a baby destined to be erased? I read the letter last. It was short. Just 5 lines. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. They'll come for him. Don't let them take him. Don't trust anyone, especially the ones who say they're here to help. He's not just a boy. He's the key. You'll see. There was no signature, but I already knew who it came from. The woman who had died on my porch. The one whose final act had been to place her child in my hands. She knew, not just what they wanted, but what he was. And now, so did I. For 2 days, I didn't move. Not far. Not beyond the clearing. I needed to heal, even if healing felt like a luxury I hadn't earned. The gash in my arm had turned angry and hot. I boiled water, tore strips from my undershirt, and did what I could. Pain like that has a sound it lives in your throat like gravel. But I kept it quiet. He watched me. The baby. Always watching. Like he knew more than he could say. Like he understood every grunt of agony, every wince of regret. His eyes followed me with something deeper than intelligence. It was as if he was waiting for me to become the man he needed me to be. So I tried. Each morning, I trained. First, my body stretches, balance, sharpening my movements with a broken broom handle I'd cut into a makeshift staff. Then my mind maps, memories, reconstructing routes from the hills to the nearest towns, remembering old smuggler trails I hadn't walked in 20 years. I was going to get him out, not just away, but free. I scouted during daylight, staying low, always circling back, careful not to leave signs. That's how I found the man. He was hanging upside down from a birch tree, a length of barbed wire wrapped around his ankle, his throat slit so cleanly that only a red line remained. Not one of mine, not one of theirs. Whoever killed him wanted me to find the body. There was a symbol carved into his chest, a circle within a square, pierced by an upward arrow. At first, I thought it was military, a new unit, maybe even part of the organization that hunted the boy. But no, I had seen that symbol before. Once, years ago, on a folder buried deep in a supply crate during my last deployment. It had been marked Project Vire. And even back then, even among monsters, it had scared the officers. I returned to the cabin at dusk with my thoughts boiling. He was awake, cooing softly, eyes bright with wonder. As if the world beyond these woods wasn't a swirling storm of blood and secrets. I held him close that night, watched the stars through the broken ceiling, and I remembered something I had forgotten long ago. What? It meant to protect something, not because you were told to, but because you chose to. The next morning, I buried the rifle. Not out of fear, but necessity. It was too loud, too crude, too tied to my old self. Instead, I forged blades from scrap metal, weighted my boots with steel caps, carved a new path. Because the war was no longer about escape. It was about purpose. I didn't understand yet what the key meant, what this child unlocked. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty: there were people willing to die to hide the truth. Which meant it had to be worth discovering. And for the first time in years, I wanted to be part of something bigger than my guilt. The snow began to melt by the end of the week. Spring always returns, no matter how bitter the winter. And as the world thawed around us, I began to plan our journey into it. Not as fugitives, but as avengers. I left the baby behind for the first time, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. The ranger station wasn't much, but I had fortified it as best I could. Nailed shut the broken windows, reinforced the doors with scavenged timber, and in the back room, behind a row of stacked crates and a trap door I'd found under the floorboards, I laid him down among blankets, pillows, and silence. He didn't cry. He just watched. His dark eyes locked on mine, as if to say he understood what I was about to do, that he trusted me to come back. That trust felt heavier than any weapon I carried. The road ahead was dangerous, and the only thing more dangerous than running was not knowing what you were running from. That's why I needed answers, real ones. Not legends whispered by dying women, or cryptic messages from the dead. The man I needed to find was buried in the foothills of Mount Orion, in a community that barely existed on maps, known only to those who had lost something to the world and wanted to disappear from it in return. Some called it the settlement. Others whispered another name, Siltline. A place where identities were buried and reborn, where mercenaries rested between sins and ghosts took off their masks for a night. It was 2 days away through broken terrain. I traveled by foot, sticking to the ravines, climbing rock faces that split under my weight, crossing streams where the water turned my legs to stone. I didn't eat much, didn't drink enough. I couldn't afford to waste time. I arrived at dusk on the third day. The sun had gone red behind the ridge, casting long shadows through the crooked cabins of Siltline. Smoke drifted from chimneys that hadn't seen clean wood in years. Children ran barefoot, eyes hollow. Men leaned against doorframes with knives hidden behind their backs, the kind of place where pasts came to bleed out. And in the farthest cabin, beneath an antenna of rusted wires and a roof made from the fuselage of a crashed aircraft, I found the man they called Baker. I knew him once. Or, more accurately, I had hunted him once. Before I left the world of orders and missions and quietly buried casualties. He was a handler, a fixer, a ghost with too many teeth, and he owed me. For letting him live. I didn't need to say my name. The moment I walked through his rotting threshold, he stood up from his desk and narrowed his eyes like I was the shadow of something he'd hoped he'd never see again. I held out the photograph, the one of the baby, the soldier, the file marked Officialand, watched the color drain from his face. He didn't ask where I got it. He simply reached for a bottle, poured himself 2 fingers, and slid a folder across the table. Dust clung to the cover like rot. There was no title, just a single number, 1098. Inside, I saw the same symbol I had found carved into the corpse by the birch tree circle in a square pierced by an upward arrow. Project Vire. Baker didn't speak, but his eyes told me everything. This wasn't just a black site experiment, it was a breeding ground, a long-term genetic project designed not to cure diseases or defend nations but to create children who could become weapons without knowing they were weapons. The boy, the one I now carried through frozen trails and fed by hand, had been designated Asset Theta 9, a prototype, a proof of concept. His parents weren't just victims of war, they were chosen, matched, controlled. And when the experiment was over, they were eliminated, except he had survived. And now, every faction that had once funded Project Vire wanted him dead, or worse, reclaimed. I closed the folder and burned it in Baker's stove. Not out of mercy, but because some knowledge poisons faster than it saves. On my way out, I asked a single question. One that had gnawed at me since the moment I first held that crying bundle of silence in my arms. Why had the woman brought him to me? Why me? Why not a stranger closer to town? Why not someone with family, or medical training, or even a stable roof? Baker said nothing. But as I turned to leave, he dropped a slip of paper into my hand. One I didn't read until I was well beyond Siltline's reach. It was my own name, followed by a string of coordinates. Underneath, in shaky ink, you were part of it. You just didn't know. That night I vomited until there was nothing left in me but salt and bone. Memories came back in Pisces shadows flickering at the edge of sleep. Missions I thought were rescues that were actually extractions. Villages I was told had been cleared by disease that were cleared by bullets. And a woman. The woman on my porch. The woman who had screamed once, years ago, as she was dragged into the back of a van while I stood frozen outside a chain-link fence. I had been told she was a suspect, a courier, a threat. I hadn't known she was pregnant. I hadn't known she had recognized me. But now I understood why her dying hands had pushed the child into mine. Because she remembered me. Because she believed I had once tried to help, and this was my second chance. When I returned to the ranger station, I found the trapdoor broken. The blankets scattered. The baby gone. For a moment, the world went silent. My breath stopped. My heart became a stone. I moved through the cabin like a corpse in reverse, looking for blood, for signs of struggle, for anything that might tell me he had simply crawled somewhere and fallen asleep. But I knew the moment I saw the boot prints outside the window too clean, too precise. I knew by the way the nails in the front door had been removed, not broken. Whoever came had done so quietly. Professionally, they had taken him, and they hadn't left a trail. I stood outside in the ash-colored light of dawn, the wind clawing at my coat, and I made a vow so deep it didn't come from my throat but from whatever was left of my soul. I would find him. I would follow whatever nightmare tunnels these people lived in, and I would not stop. Not until he was back in my arms. Not until every hand that touched him with evil was cold and still. They had taken something sacred, and I would burn the sky to get it back. I didn't sleep. I didn't stop. I didn't eat. The tracks had vanished. The snow had been swept clean, and not by the wind. Whoever took the boy was trained. Military, or worse corporate extraction teams, who operated without flags, without names, without conscience. Ghosts with orders. Professionals paid to erase. But they left something behind. One of the old transmitters in the cabin had picked up a faint signal, low, pulsing ping, repeating every 17 seconds. I wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't leaned against the wall to catch my breath. It was coming from the baby's blanket. They had marked him, not just genetically. They had implanted something inside him, or on him. A frequency tracker built to blend into background noise, invisible to most surveillance. But I had worked with these signals before. I knew their pattern, their rhythm. I calibrated the receiver with shaking hands, followed the blip through the hills, across the frozen basin, over dead rivers and hollow tunnels of collapsed mining shafts. My boots bled at the seams, my coat stiffened from sweat and frost, and still I walked. For 2 days, the signal led me nowhere. But on the third, just before dawn, the sound grew louder. And that's when I saw it. Carved into the base of a mountain like a scar was a narrow passage, guarded by stone, shadow, and silence. No lights, no guards. Just a hum in the air and a warmth that didn't belong to nature. This wasn't a cave. It was a door. I slipped inside. The walls were steel, covered with moss and rust, broken cables hanging like vines. Someone had tried to shut it down, but not all of it. The deeper I went, the cleaner it became. Rust gave way to glass, stone to smooth corridors. Ancient generators hummed beneath my feet, and behind the walls, I felt movement machines breathing, watching. This place wasn't abandoned. It had simply been waiting. A sign above one of the doors read, Vire Complex, Site Theta Zero. Theta Zero. The beginning. The first. The place where it all started. And he was here. I followed the signal deeper into the heart of the mountain, down staircases slick with condensation, and through sliding doors that opened before I could touch them. The architecture was old, but not dead. Artificial intelligence systems were still running. Cameras followed me, but didn't sound the alarm, as if they recognized me. Or him. Maybe it was all the same now. I reached the main chamber. Rows of empty cribs. Surgical tables. Walls filled with monitors showing vitals, DNA sequences, neurological spikes. In the center, a tank filled with thick blue fluid, and inside it, not the boy. Something else. Something older. A woman. Or what used to be one. Her body floated, tubes attached to her spine, eyes closed in agony. Her skin was pale. Her veins glowed faintly with light. And above her, on the glass, was etched the same symbol I had seen in the folder and on the bodies before. A circle. A square. An upward arrow. I didn't understand. Until I looked at the data on the screens. She was the source. She was the prototype. They had taken her cells, her strength, her suffering, and turned them into a template. To create others. To create him. The boy wasn't a random result of war. He was a clone. Not in the way the world understood clones. Not a copy. Not a duplicate. But a distilled being, genetically crafted from fragments of enhanced DNA. Shaped to develop beyond ordinary human limits. Immune to most diseases. Resistant to environmental extremes. Neurologically adaptive, and deeply dangerously empathic. A child built to survive anything. Or to break under everything. And someone had decided that he was no longer necessary. I found the holding cell at the end of the corridor. Glass walls. A biometric lock. And behind them, him. He was lying on the floor, curled up in the same position I had left him in, hands clenched into tiny fists, but breathing. Alive. I approached the glass, pressing my hand to it. He opened his eyes. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He just looked at me, blinking slowly, as if he had known I would come. As if nothing that had happened between us was broken. As if the silence of betrayal could be repaired by presence alone. But I couldn't get to him. The lock required authorization. And then I heard footsteps. Quiet. Deliberate. The sound of a man who walked like the world belonged to him. He stepped into the room with no fear, dressed in a black coat, gloves, and a badge that bore no name. Just the emblem again, embossed in silver. He didn't introduce himself. But I recognized him. From a mission. Years ago. A mission where I was told to guard a convoy that never made it to its destination. Where I was told to look away when children were taken in the night. Where I signed paperwork I never read. He had been there. And he remembered me. He called the boy a mistake. Said the emotional bond had created instability in his neurocore. That he had developed attachments, memories, fear. Something no weapon should have. He said they were going to reset him. That it would be painless. And that I could walk away. Again, just like last time. He didn't reply. I just raised my weapon. But he had one too. The chamber erupted into violence. Bullets split the air. Shards of glass flew like razors. The lights burst above us. I moved like instinct, like muscle memory. Years of killing clawing their way back through my skin. He was faster, but I was angry. And that made me something else entirely. By the time I stood over him, he was choking on his own blood. He reached for his radio. I crushed it under my boot. Then I turned to the cell. Alarms screamed now. Lights flashed red. But the door was open. The boy hadn't waited. He had walked through it the moment the man hit the ground. He stood before me, not afraid, not confused, just waiting. I picked him up. He rested his head against my shoulder. And for the first time since the woman died on my porch, I felt something close to peace. But it didn't last. The mountain began to shake. Self-destruct protocols. Countdown codes. Emergency triggers. The whole site was rigged to burn in the event of compromise. I ran, carried him through smoke and steam and collapsing halls, as if I were carrying the last piece of truth in a world built on lies. We emerged from the exit tunnel as fire swallowed the past behind us. The mountain groaned like a beast, dying in its sleep. And then, silence. I held him in the snow. His eyes never left the smoke curling into the sky. And he knew this was not the end, only a pause. Because the people who built him were not gone. They were only watching. And they had seen me choose him, which meant next time they wouldn't send a retrieval team. They would send an army. And I would be ready. The silence after the mountain's collapse was almost unbearable. The world seemed to hold its breath. I held the boy close, his small body trembling against mine, the cold biting through the threadbare blanket wrapped around him. His dark eyes scanned the horizon, unblinking and unnervingly steady, as if he was watching for something only he could see. I didn't speak. Words felt cheap after what we'd just escaped. I was more afraid of breaking the fragile calm between us than anything else. His name was Thomas, or at least, that's what the woman had called him. But he was more than just a name. He was a living cipher, a puzzle I wasn't sure I was smart enough to solve. The snow cracked underfoot as I carried him down the ridge, every step sinking into the frostbitten ground. I had no plan, no destination, only a desperate instinct to move, to survive, and to protect. For years I'd chosen solitude. The endless prairie, the whispering wind, the quiet night-sit was all I had. But now, that quiet was gone. It was replaced by the pounding urgency of responsibility. I was no longer just a man with a cabin. I was a guardian, a protector of something precious and fragile. We reached an abandoned ranger station hidden in a thicket of evergreens, half buried by snow and time. The windows were cracked, the door hanging on rusty hinges, but inside it was dry, warm enough to keep Thomas from freezing. I set him down on a tattered mattress and pulled out what little food I had, left a stale piece of bread and some dried meat. He ate with slow, tentative bites, eyes never leaving mine. Sleep finally came that night, fitful and short. I lay beside him, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the weight of the world settle onto my chest. I thought about the men we'd left behind in that mountain, Crenshaw, Frank, Jenkins Sand, the deeper shadows that hunted us. I thought about the blood on Elena's dress, about the lies and betrayals, about the network of killers and profiteers who saw children like Thomas as nothing more than currency. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of morning that steals the color from the world. I packed what little I had, strapped Thomas into a makeshift carrier on my back, and set out toward the nearest town. It was a risky move, but I knew we needed allies. I couldn't face what was coming alone. The journey was slow. The boy's weight grew heavier with each mile, and the landscape grew harsher. Frostbite crept at my fingers and toes. My lungs burned in the thin air, but I pushed on, fueled by a fierce determination I hadn't felt since my wife died all those years ago. In town, the faces were unfamiliar, guarded. People whispered about the war, about raids and disappearances, about the government's secret experiments. No one wanted to get involved, and I couldn't blame them. Fear was a powerful silencer. But then I found her. Mara. She ran a small clinic on the edge of town. Her eyes held stories of loss and resilience, scars that mirrored my own. When I showed her Thomas, when I told her everything, the baby, the mountain, the hunter-sure expression shifted from skepticism to fierce resolve. She agreed to help. The clinic was a sanctuary, a fragile island of hope amid chaos. Mara ran tests on Thomas, carefully, gently. She traced the faint lines beneath his skin where the tracker had been embedded, marveled at the strength of his immune system, the unusual patterns in his brainwaves. She said he was unique and anomaly in a world that had forgotten how to be human. But she also warned me. The men who wanted Thomas wouldn't stop. Not until they had him. We spent days preparing. Mara's clinic became a refuge. She rigged alarms, reinforced the doors, and taught me how to handle basic first aid and infections. We gathered supplies, food, medicine, anything we could find to stay ready. The townsfolk who trusted us came by with what little they had, small gestures of hope in a world worn thin. Thomas began to change. He grew stronger, more alert. His eyes, once distant, now followed us with growing curiosity. He reached out for Mara, for me, slowly learning trust. But sometimes he pulled back, as if chased by memories too heavy to understand. There was a shadow in his gaze, and I feared what might be buried deep within him. One night, Mara found me staring at the fire, lost in thought. "You carry a heavy burden," she said softly. "But you're not alone." Her words settled over me like a gentle warmth. For the first time in years, I felt something stir inside, something I hadn't felt in a long while. Hope. But hope is a delicate thing. That night, the quiet was torn apart by the sound of engines. Outside the clinic, headlights cut through the dark like blades. A group had come more than we could count, armed and masked. Whoever they were, they'd tracked us down. We had only hours to prepare. I stood beside Mara and Thomas as the first sounds of confrontation echoed outside. The walls trembled. The windows cracked. We braced ourselves. Engines roared as the group circled the clinic, cutting off escape. I felt Thomas tense beside me, his tiny hands gripping tight, sensing the fear in the air. Mara moved fast, steady as ever, giving instructions and taking position. Her courage held us together. Glass shattered. I grabbed what I could: old rifles, heavy furniture, anything to slow them down. Townsfolk arrived, some with tools, others with whatever they could find to stand beside us. This wasn't just our fight anymore, it was all of ours. The first intruder forced his way in. I reacted instinctively, defending the clinic with a shot that echoed loud and final. He dropped, but more followed. Mara shielded Thomas behind a heavy table while I covered them. My hands moved without thinking, every instinct sharpened by years of hardship. But these men weren't amateurs, they were precise, relentless. Time blurred into bursts of movement, urgent voices, and silent prayers. Somewhere in the chaos, Thomas cried, Altha's voice cutting through everything. My heart clenched. I wasn't just fighting to survive. I was fighting for his right to grow up safe, to have a life beyond all this. One of them got close, too close. I moved without thinking, stepping into his path. Pain flared in my side, but I stayed on my feet. I had to. The minutes dragged on. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The last of them was forced to retreat, their plans broken for now. I dropped to the floor, drained. Mara rushed to me, her eyes full of emotion. Is he okay? I asked. She nodded, smiling through the exhaustion. He's safe, thanks to you. Morning came. Light spilled through shattered windows, illuminating the wreckage. We had made it through the night, but we knew this was just the beginning. I looked down at Thomas, asleep in my arms, finally at peace, and in that moment, I understood what family truly meant. Not just shared blood, but sacrifice, love, and choosing to protect those who can't protect themselves. No matter what came next, I would be there. I would fight for him. The silence after the storm felt heavier than the chaos. Pain crept in. Exhaustion pressed down. Mara cleaned my wound quietly, her voice low as she whispered, You saved him, but they'll come again. I held Thomas close. His breath was slow, steady. The world had shown its dark side, but he didn't have to carry that weight yet. It was our job to make sure he held on to his humanity, his innocence. Those who came after him weren't acting alone. They were part of something larger, a network reaching beyond towns and borders, one that thrived in secrecy. And they wouldn't give up easily, but neither would we. Mara and I talked in hushed voices late into the night, planning, questioning, hoping. We couldn't just run. That would be to hand Thomas over to his fate. No, we had to fight not just for survival, but for justice. For the chance that this little boy might one day grow up without fear. The townspeople rallied quietly, offering help in ways small and large. Food, shelter, watchful eyes in the darkness. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of something I thought I'd lost forever: community. Maybe this child had brought me back to life in ways I hadn't expected. But the cost was clear. Every moment spent protecting Thomas was a moment spent looking over my shoulder. Every shadow held a threat, every stranger a potential enemy. And as I healed, I knew the final confrontation was inevitable. That knowledge settled in my bones like winter's chill. When dawn broke again, I steeled myself. Mara's eyes met mine fierce, unyielding. "We don't have much time," she said. I nodded, cradling Thomas close. "Then let's finish this. For him. For the family we're becoming." The fight ahead would demand everything we had, but I was no longer just a lonely man living in the shadows. I was a guardian, a protector, and nothing, not even death, would take Thomas from me. The night before the final storm was quiet, too quiet. I lay awake in the dim cabin light, watching Thomas sleep. His tiny chest rose and fell, a fragile beacon of hope amidst the darkness that had swallowed so much of my life before. In his peaceful face, I saw the future I never dared to imagine, one worth fighting for, worth risking everything. But the world outside wasn't done with us yet. The air held a charge, the kind that presses against your skin and sets your nerves on edge. Mara paced, her eyes sharp and unreadable. We both knew what was coming, the last desperate move from men who had everything to lose and nothing left to give. When the dawn broke, it came with a howl of engines and the stomp of boots. Not horses this time, machines roaring like thunder, shaking the earth beneath the cabin. They had brought more men, better weapons. This was no longer just about one baby. It was about control, power, fear. I stood at the cabin door, rifle in hand, heart pounding like a war drum. Thomas in my arms, Mara by my side, two ghosts of my old life and two flames lighting the path ahead. The intruders came with cold eyes and cruel smiles, expecting to find weakness. But they found something else. I remembered my wife, her strength, her hope, the love we never got to give a child. I felt it in every bone, in every breath. I was not the broken, isolated man I once was. I was a father now, and fathers do not back down. The battle was fierce and brutal. Gunfire echoed through the trees, shattering the fragile peace. Mara moved with deadly grace, covering our retreat, while I held the line. Every shot fired a promise that Thomas would live free. Amidst the chaos, Thomas cried out, his voice small but fierce. That cry cut through the noise like a lightning bolt, awakening something ancient and primal in me. I fought not just with bullets, but with every ounce of my soul. When the last of them fell, silence crashed down like a wave. The sun rose over a battlefield marked with scars, but it also rose on something new, a home rebuilt from ashes, a family forged through fire. Mara knelt beside me, her hands trembling as she reached for Thomas. "We did it," she whispered. But I knew the fight was far from over. This victory was not the end, but a beginning. Holding Thomas close, I looked out at the horizon, endless and full of promise. For the first time in decades, I dared to dream, not just of survival, but of a life where love could grow in the darkest places. Because that's what family is. It's not blood or history or perfect stories. It's the choice to protect, to fight, to hope even when the world says you shouldn't. I'm Silas Whitmore, and this is our story. A story about the cost of compassion, the strength of sacrifice, and the power of redemption. If you've walked this path with me, if Thomas's journey touched your heart, then don't let this story end here. Subscribe now, join us, and be part of a community where stories come alive, where every whisper of courage, every spark of hope, every fight for justice echoes through the ages. Because sometimes, the smallest light can blaze a trail through the darkest night, and together, we'll keep that light burning. Click the video on the screen now for a story even more unforgettable, a tale of mercy, vengeance, and the true meaning of family. Your journey is just beginning.